That day, the city was just being the city. Fishing boats were rocking gently in the harbor. Old stone buildings were casting long shadows into narrow streets. People were going to work. Kids were running through alleyways. Nothing unusual, nothing special. And no one realized they were standing right in the middle of something invisible. Then the child stopped. He let go of his mother's hand and looked at the display case. Not at the lights, not at the people, but at the faded parchment behind the glass. It was as if something there was calling him, quietly, but insistently. He stepped closer, placed his fingers on the cold glass, and then he spoke. Words came out of his mouth that even he didn't fully understand. They weren't loud. They didn't echo through the room. But everyone heard them. Because that single sentence completed a silence that had been unfinished for 2,000 years. No one there was used to hearing that kind of certainty in a child's voice. He wasn't telling a story. He wasn't imagining things. It felt like he was remembering something he was never meant to forget. At first, his mother smiled. Then, she went quiet. The guide stopped talking. The museum staff looked at each other, because what the child had just said matched the most controversial line of a text scholars had been struggling with for months. And that line, no one had ever been able to decode it. No one said the word miracle. No one called him chosen. But everyone felt the same thing. This moment was not ordinary. It was as if time itself had paused, in the wrong place, in the wrong body, but at exactly the right moment. And that small child, still just learning about the world, had been given a burden far older than the world he knew. The staff member looked at the child, then at Elena. There was a familiar smile on his face, the kind that says, "Kids say things." Still, he stopped in front of the display. He glanced at the papyrus, and then, without realizing it, his brow tightened. "This text," he said quietly, "hasn't been fully translated yet." Lucas lifted his head, not toward the staff member, but toward the lines behind the glass. It felt as if time had slowed down for him. The whispers around them, the sound of footsteps, even his mother's breathing, all faded away. "Because they're hiding it," he said. This time his voice was even softer, but heavier. Elena felt her throat tighten. She knew her son. Lucas didn't speak like this. He didn't form sentences, and he had never spoken with this kind of clarity, this kind of certainty. "Who's hiding it, Lucas?" she whispered. The child paused. His eyes weren't focused on the reflection in the glass. They seemed to be somewhere else entirely, far behind, centuries back. "The one who wrote it," he said, because he couldn't say the teacher's name, but he loved him. At that moment, the nearby guide fell silent. Two visitors stopped talking. The staff member's hand moved, without thinking, to his radio. For the first time in a long while, the papyrus didn't feel like an artifact. It felt like a witness, releasing something it had never been able to say through the mouth of a 6-year-old child. In that instant, Elena understood something deeply. Her son wasn't learning anything. He was remembering. And this memory didn't belong to today. It didn't belong to this life. The museum may have looked as quiet as ever, but no one could claim that the silence was the same anymore. Because there are moments like this. They go unnoticed. They aren't recorded, but they quietly change the direction of history. And that day, inside the Egyptian National Museum, history paused for a moment and looked at a child. Elena closed her notebook. Her fingers were shaking slightly. As an academic, she had seen countless strange texts before. Myths, heretical teachings, apocryphal writings. But this was the first time she felt a text echoing inside a child's mind. At the end of the back corridor, there was a small table, magnifying glasses, gloves, yellowed papers. A young researcher working there looked up. "Was there something you wanted to take a look at?" he asked. Eleanor steadied herself. "It's about the papyrus that was on display yesterday," she said. "I just wanted to see it again." The researcher nodded. "It's a difficult text," he said. "We understand better what it isn't than what it actually is." That sentence echoed inside Elena, just like Lucas's voice, short, clear, but hard to explain. When they got home, Lucas had lined up his toys on the floor. Small cars, colorful blocks, a dinosaur. Everything was in its place. Everything looked normal. Eleanor stood in the kitchen and watched him. Lucas picked up one block, placed it next to another, then stopped, as if he felt that something was missing. "Lucas," she said gently, "do you remember what you saw at the museum yesterday?" The child didn't look up. He stayed silent for a moment. Then he said just one sentence. "It was closed." Eleanor froze. "What do you mean?" she asked. Lucas put the block down. "The writing was closed," he said. "The person inside couldn't speak." This time, Elena didn't ask another question, because she knew. The more she pushed, the more Lucas would retreat inward. "Okay," she said softly. "Is it speaking now?" Lucas nodded, but it wasn't really a yes. It was more an acceptance. "Someone heard it," he said. "It doesn't have to stay silent anymore." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She wrote down everything Lucas had said, not the words, the tone, the pauses, the moments when he avoided eye contact. And at some point, she found herself facing a question she never wanted to ask. What if Lucas wasn't decoding the text? What if the text was remembering Lucas? By morning, she had made her decision. This was no longer just a museum matter. It couldn't stay within the walls of academia. Because there are questions that should never be answered, but there are others that become far more dangerous when they are never asked at all. And Elena was getting ready to ask that question. Lucas's first meeting didn't go as planned. Carter arrived with an academic reflex. He had his notebook. He had his pen. His questions were ready. But Lucas wasn't. The moment he saw Carter, the child stepped behind his mother. No eye contact. He refused to sit down. He pretended to be interested only in the patterns on the carpet. Carter noticed, and for the first time, he did something he wasn't used to. He stepped back. "Let's not push him," he said quietly to Elena. Let him decide. Minutes passed. The silence stretched. Finally, Lucas picked up one of the small toy stones on the floor. He held it, then placed it back down. Stones don't speak, he said suddenly. But there was certainty in his voice. Carter looked up. When don't they speak? He asked gently. When no one listens. That answer was enough for Carter to close his notebook, because that wasn't a child's response. It was a statement of witness. Is the text you're holding like a stone too? Carter asked. Does it want to speak, but no one is listening? Lucas nodded. This time it was clear. The person there, he said, couldn't say the name. If he said the name, everyone else would fall silent. Elena felt a chill run through her. What do you mean? She asked instinctively. Lucas shrugged. Some names are heavy, he said. Like stones. Carter looked at Elena. There was no doubt in that look now. No curiosity either. Only attention. That text, Carter said slowly. We need to read it again. Again? Elena asked. It's been studied for months. No, Carter said. This time, we listen. The next day, there were 3 people in the closed section of the museum. Elena, Carter, and Lucas. No one recorded anything. No cameras were turned on. This wasn't an experiment. It was an invitation. When Lucas stopped in front of the glass, he didn't raise his finger this time. He closed his eyes. There's someone here, he said. Someone who's afraid. Afraid of whom? Carter asked. Of words, Lucas said. Because words get misunderstood. Elena closed her eyes. In that moment, she understood. This child wasn't reading a text. He was walking through a memory. Lucas continued. The teacher, everyone knew him, but the one who loved him had to stay hidden. Carter's hand trembled. That sentence matched perfectly the most debated gap in the papyrus, and for the first time, Carter said it out loud. This is not a doctrinal text. Elena whispered, Then what is it? Carter looked at Lucas, then at the papyrus, then at time itself. This, he said, is the testimony of a witness who wants to be remembered. The museum was silent again, but this silence was no longer protected, no longer held, no longer hidden, because there are truths that don't reveal themselves. They don't explode into the open. They simply awaken when someone finally listens. And Lucas had awakened something. Carter leaned back in his chair. For the first time, his mind was struggling this much without a text in front of him. What Lucas was saying didn't feel like information. It didn't sound memorized. And it definitely didn't sound like a child's imagination. Recalling, Carter said slowly. It sounds like an old word. Lucas pushed the toy car forward again. But this time, not like he was playing, like he was following a path. Some things, he said, are never forgotten. They just stay silent. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. She didn't want to break the moment. Carter stood up, walked a few steps across the room. Then he knelt down to Lucas's level again. He softened his voice on purpose. So, he said, why did that person write it? Lucas answered without hesitation. Because he couldn't speak. Who silenced him? Carter asked. Lucas shook his head. No one, he said. He silenced himself. That answer shook Carter, because that was the darkest possibility hidden inside the text. Not oppression, not force, but a silence born out of fear. And the writing, Carter said, was that his voice? Lucas nodded. This time, very slowly, very deliberately. Not a voice, he said, a trace. That word echoed inside Carter's mind, because that was exactly what the papyrus was missing. Not a doctrine, not a call, not a command. The text left a trace. It didn't speak to the reader. It spoke to the one who was searching. Then why now? Carter asked. Lucas stopped the car, placed his hands on his knees. The movement wasn't that of a child, but of someone who had been waiting for a very long time. Because now, he said, someone isn't reading it wrong anymore. Someone is listening. Carter took a deep breath. At this point, the line between him and science had grown thin, but it hadn't broken. Not yet. Lucas, he said, who do you think this text belongs to? Lucas looked away. This time, the answer didn't come right away. I won't say, he said finally. Not yet. Why? Elena asked, her voice trembling. Lucas looked at his mother. There was no fear in his eyes, but there was a heavy sense of responsibility. Because names, he said, change time. In that moment, Carter understood something clearly. What this child carried didn't belong only to the past. If spoken out loud, it could shake the present as well. Carter straightened up, turned to Elena. We can't publish this text, he said firmly. Not yet. Then what do we do? Elena asked. Carter looked at Lucas, then toward the corridor where the papyrus was kept, then at the closed doors. We wait, he said, and we keep listening. Lucas picked up his toy car from the floor, took a step toward Carter, placed the car on the table between them. You've heard it now, he said. You can't go back. Carter didn't respond, because he knew there are moments that turn even a scientist into a witness. And that day, Dr. Matthew Carter didn't decode a text. But for the first time, he truly heard a silence. That realization unsettled Carter, because the idea that a text might have a right moment wandered along the edges of scientific thinking. But the small gap Lucas had pointed to wasn't random, just like the gaps inside the papyrus. That day, Carter didn't leave Cairo. He canceled his flight, locked himself in his hotel room, and reopened every copy of the text. He re-examined the symbols once labeled insignificant, the marginal notes, the unfinished lines, one by one. And then he noticed something. The text hadn't been written on a flat surface. Some words were deliberately pushed toward the edges. Some lines were intentionally cut short, as if the writer wasn't testing the reader's attention, but their patience. Whoever wants to find it must know how to wait, Carter murmured to himself. This wasn't an academic conclusion. It was intuition, and it had been a long time since Carter trusted intuition. The next day, he and Elena had a long conversation. This time, not as an academic and a mother, but as two witnesses. We can't keep Lucas involved in this, Elena said. He's only 6. Carter nodded. You're right, he said. But we also have to accept something. It's as if he was born into this. Elena's eyes filled with tears. This shouldn't be his burden. It shouldn't, Carter said. And maybe it isn't. Maybe he's just the one who opens the door. That same day, an unexpected visitor arrived at the museum, a researcher from the Vatican archives. There was no official appointment, but the papyrus had been mentioned somewhere, in an article, in a preliminary report, in a whisper. When Carter learned this, Lucas's words came back to him. Names change time. And he understood. Time had already begun to shift. That evening, as Elena tucked Lucas into bed, the child suddenly spoke. They're looking now, he said. Who's looking? Elena asked. Lucas stared at the ceiling. The wrong people, he said. But it's not too late. Elena's voice trembled. Not too late for what? Lucas closed his eyes. To hide it in the right place. The next morning, Carter submitted a short, clear report to the museum administration. He recommended that the papyrus be moved into temporary storage. For conservation reasons, he said. No one objected, because no one knew the real reason. But Carter knew, Elena knew, and Lucas had known from the very beginning. Some texts aren't written to be read. Some testimonies aren't left to be heard, but to be entrusted. And now the question was this. How much longer could that trust remain hidden? That thought didn't just disturb Carter. It pinned him in place. A key. But who had made the lock? During the hours they spent in the archive, Eleanor barely spoke. She turned pages, marked underlined sentences, but her mind was somewhere else. She wasn't worried as a mother. She was worried as a human being. If Lucas is a key, she said at last, what does he open? Carter didn't answer, because there was no answer. Not yet. That night, Carter wrote down every sentence Lucas had spoken, in chronological order. He didn't interpret any of them. He just wrote. Something strange emerged. When the sentences came together, they formed the skeleton of a missing text, as if Lucas wasn't completing the papyrus itself, but the spaces that had been left blank. And those gaps matched the gaps found in forbidden texts. At one point, Carter stopped. On the edge of the notebook, he wrote a single word in capital letters. Choice. These texts had been suppressed because they were dangerous, but the danger wasn't in what they taught. The danger was in what they didn't force. They didn't demand obedience. They didn't impose belief. They said only one thing. If you listen, you will understand. And that was unacceptable to anyone who wanted to control order. The next day, when Lucas came home from school, he was unusually quiet. He didn't touch his toys. He didn't turn on the television. He sat by the window. Elena joined him. Did something happen? She asked. Lucas didn't nod, but he didn't deny it either. Today, he said, someone remembered me. A chill ran through Elena. Who? She asked. Lucas shrugged. I don't know the name, he said, but they know the text. With that sentence, a single possibility formed in Elena's mind. And that possibility turned her into something more than a mother. It turned her into a protector. That same evening, Carter's phone rang. The number was hidden. "I'd advise you to stop taking an interest in the papyrus," the voice on the other end said. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't friendly. It was simply final. Carter stayed calm. "We're talking about an academic study," he said. "Interest isn't a crime." After a brief silence, the voice spoke again. "Some things," it said, "aren't crimes, but they are never without cost." The line went dead. In that moment, Carter knew for sure. This text wasn't coming only from the past. It was disturbing the present as well. And Lucas knew far more than a child ever should. But maybe the real question was this: had Lucas found the text? Or had the text finally found Lucas? Because there are some keys that are never found by accident. When the time comes, they find their owner. That realization sent a chill through Carter, because the idea of those who remember had always been dangerous throughout history. Those who wrote were burned. Those who spoke were silenced. But those who remembered, they left traces, and traces could not be erased. Carter sat on the edge of the table. "These texts," he said to Elena, "weren't written to spread a belief." "Then what were they written for?" she asked. "Not to be remembered," Carter said, "but to avoid being remembered wrong." Elena's expression darkened. "So the truth," she said slowly, "could it have been hidden?" "Not hidden," Carter replied. "Fragmented. Names erased, narratives divided, witnesses pushed into shadow. All of it served the same purpose: to keep the story from belonging to a single person. Because when there is only one name, it becomes easy to destroy it." That evening, Lucas fell asleep early, but Carter couldn't sleep. He opened his notebook and wrote a new heading: "The Nameless Witness." Under it, he wrote a single sentence: "The one who hides his name protects the truth." Just before dawn, Carter noticed something else. In apocryphal texts, the word teacher was never defined directly. There was no physical description, no precise date, but the narrators, they all shared the same emotion: closeness, loyalty, and fear. This wasn't the language of a student. It was the language of someone who walked beside him. The next day, Carter decided to ask Lucas one final question, a very simple one. "Those who remembered," he said, "why did they stay silent?" Lucas sat up in bed. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he whispered, "Because when they stayed silent, the teacher was still alive." That answer collapsed every academic wall inside Carter, because this wasn't a statement of belief. It was a reflex of memory. Elena couldn't hold back her tears. "Lucas," she asked softly, "how do you know these things?" Lucas looked at his mother. There was innocence in his eyes, but there was no ignorance. "I don't know," he said. "I remember." In that moment, Carter understood. This child wasn't explaining a text. He was preserving a silence. And maybe the true task was never to reveal the truth. Maybe the task was to keep it in the right place. Because there are stories that break when told too loudly, and there are witnesses who can only survive as a whisper. That thought calmed Carter for the first time, because the answer was no longer in the question, why was it hidden, but in another one. To whom was it entrusted? The texts hadn't been concealed. They hadn't locked themselves away. They simply hadn't rushed. Carter drew an arrow in the margin of his notebook. The arrow pointed from text to reader. Then he stopped, erased it, and drew it again. This time, the arrow pointed from reader to text. The text doesn't choose, he said quietly. It waits until the reader is ready. Eleanor looked at him. Do you think Lucas is ready? She asked. It sounded less like a question for an academic and more like one from a mother. Carter thought for a long time before answering. He's not ready, he said finally, but he's open. That difference mattered, because being ready was something learned, but being open was a state that hadn't been damaged yet. The next day, something strange happened at the museum. The young woman on duty in the papyrus section noticed that the artifact had shifted, even though no instructions had been given. The glass case was the same. The lighting was the same. But the papyrus had moved by a few centimeters. They checked the records. No cameras, no traces. No one had touched it. When Carter was informed, his first thought wasn't security. It was the text. Sometimes, he whispered, they move. Eleanor flinched. Who? She asked. The testimonies, Carter said. When the listener changes, the place changes too. That evening, Lucas was restless in bed. He wasn't sleeping, but he wasn't fully awake either. Eleanor, he said suddenly, I heard something. She sat down on the edge of his bed. What did you hear? A name, Lucas said, but I don't need to say it. Why not? She asked. Because it's not protected anymore, Lucas said. If the name is spoken, it turns into something else. Eleanor's throat tightened. Into what? She asked. Lucas didn't answer. He just pulled the blanket a little closer. That meant the conversation was over. That night, Carter wrote one final sentence in his notebook. Perhaps the most important one. Some texts are not written to be explained, but to be kept alive. And perhaps Lucas's role was never to be a hero. Certainly not a prophet. He was simply the space where the story could breathe. Because sometimes history survives best in the place that stays silent the longest. With that realization, a door opened in Carter's mind. But this door didn't open outward. It opened inward. There was no place, because place was never a fixed point. These texts didn't belong to a geography. They belonged to a state. Carter wrote a single word in his notebook. Threshold. Temporary shelters, he said to Elena, aren't meant for staying. They're meant for passing through. Elena looked at Lucas. Then, she asked softly, why did they pass through? Before answering, Lucas looked again at the 3 dots on the table. Then he traced the line between them with his finger. Because someone was coming from behind, he said, and if they stopped, the story would turn to stone. That phrase shook Carter. Turn to stone. The expression cold stones in the texts suddenly made sense. This wasn't just about a place. It was a metaphor for stillness. So, Carter said, they had to keep moving. Lucas nodded. To remember, he said, you have to walk. That sentence didn't exist in any academic text Carter had ever read. Yet it was the missing piece in all of them. That evening, Carter stepped outside the museum. He merged into the crowds of Cairo. He walked through narrow streets, noticed places where sunlight barely reached, points where water could be heard but not seen, passageways of cold stone. And for the first time, he thought this: these texts didn't belong to a single place. They belonged to every place that shared the same way of seeing. The next day, Lucas didn't go to school. Elena had taken permission because Carter wanted to try one last thing. They went to the oldest, least visited section of the museum. There was no display case, no explanatory plaque, just emptiness. Lucas stopped, bent down, as if he were looking into something invisible. This isn't it, he said, but it's like it. How? Carter asked. Lucas stood up. People look here too, he said. They search, but they don't listen. With that sentence, Carter understood something crucial. Searching and finding were not the same thing. And maybe that was why, for 2,000 years, no one had ever found this story, because everyone had wanted a map. But this story was asking for direction. As Lucas walked toward the exit, he stopped, looked at Carter. They were never going to return, he said, because if they did, the story would close. Then, Carter asked, what happens now? Lucas shrugged, as if it was no longer his task. Now, he said, you keep walking. And in that moment, Carter understood. Lucas wasn't a guide. He was a starting point. The story hadn't hidden its place. It had hidden its path. And that path only opened to those who knew how to listen. After that realization, Carter thought for the first time that he needed to step back. But this wasn't an escape. It was an attempt to draw a boundary, because what Lucas was saying was no longer producing knowledge. It was consuming it. Or rather, it was consuming the human being. Elena felt it too. Lucas had started waking up more often at night. He wasn't having nightmares. He wasn't crying. He was just waking up, as if something had called him. They're waiting for me, he said one night. Elena jumped out of bed. Who? She asked. Lucas didn't answer, and that silence was heavier than anything he could have said. The next day, Carter didn't go to the museum, on purpose. He turned off his phone, locked his notes in a drawer. For an academic, this was unthinkable. But this was no longer research. This was facing the consequences of contact. That afternoon, Elena's phone rang. It was Carter. We need to stop for a while, he said. We need to pull Lucas completely out of this. Elena's voice trembled. Are we too late? Carter didn't answer, because the answer to that question wasn't scientific. That evening, Lucas closed his drawing book. For the first time, he left it unfinished. He placed the pencil on the table. It's not coming anymore, he said. Elena's throat tightened. What isn't coming? Lucas looked out the window. The sun was setting. Light stretched long shadows across the walls. The voice, he said. It moved away. That sentence should have comforted Elena. But it did the opposite, because there was no relief in Lucas's tone. There was a void. When Carter heard this, he took a deep breath. Good, he said. That's a good thing. But later that night, as Carter sat alone with his notes, he realized something. The texts weren't silent. They were just changing direction. Lucas's sentences had stopped, but the gaps were still there, and gaps always call someone. Carter wrote one final note in his notebook. Some doors are never closed. You simply step away from them. And in that moment, he understood. Lucas had stepped away from the door, but the door was still open. The question was no longer, why could Lucas hear it? The real question was this: who would hear it now? Because stories can let go of a person, but they never let go of themselves. That sentence echoed in Elena's mind. No one had forced the door, which meant the door was still there. It just hadn't been pushed. Carter knew this too. The hardest moment in science isn't when you discover something new. It's when you realize you could discover it and choose to step back. The next morning he returned to the museum, but not as a researcher, as a visitor, quiet, distant. The papyrus was in storage, locked, unlit. Carter carried the key in his pocket, but he didn't take it out. Because he finally understood this. Some doors are sacred, not because they can be opened, but because they shouldn't be. As he passed through the archive, he glanced at the red-labeled files. Apocryphal, contested, unverifiable. Once, those words had provoked him. Now, they comforted him, because not everything needs to be provable. Some things survive only by remaining unproven. That day, Carter submitted a short report to the museum administration. He used academic language, cold, formal. I believe that early publication of the text may lead to misinterpretations. I recommend that further studies be suspended. No one objected, because no one knew what was truly being suspended. That evening, Lucas was playing in the garden. He dug small holes in the soil, then filled them back in. "What are you doing?" Carter asked. "I'm changing places," Lucas said. "Changing the place of what?" "The gaps." Carter smiled. This time he wasn't afraid, because Lucas's voice was light. It wasn't carrying anything. It was letting go. "Do gaps disappear?" Carter asked. Lucas shook his head. "No," he said. "They change places, but if no one looks at them, they don't cause harm." It sounded like a child's sentence, but it was also the answer Carter had been searching for weeks. That night, Carter closed his notebook. For the first time, he didn't write a new heading. He didn't write a new question. He added only one line at the bottom. Some stories are not solved. They are lived with. Lucas slept peacefully in his room. His breathing was calm. Elena stood at the threshold. She didn't step inside. She didn't even turn off the light, because now she knew there are thresholds that are not meant to be crossed, But if you stand before them with respect, they call no one. And perhaps this story, in the end, had chosen not to be told, but to be protected, quietly, without hurting anyone. Days passed. No one called from the museum. No files were reopened. The papyrus stayed in storage. Its name was not mentioned, and strangely, nothing felt missing. Before leaving Cairo, Carter passed by the museum one last time. He didn't go inside. He stopped. He looked. And he walked on. Once, that would have felt like defeat. Now, it felt like balance. As Elena dropped Lucas off at school, she adjusted his backpack. It didn't look as heavy as before. Maybe it never was. Maybe weight is only noticed when you carry it. "Mom," Lucas said as he got out of the car, "do some things come back?" Elena paused. "Like what?" she asked. Lucas thought for a moment. "Like voices." Elena knelt down to meet her son at eye level. "Sometimes," she said, "but when they do, you know what to do with them." Lucas nodded. That answer was enough. Months later, Carter didn't publish an academic paper. He didn't speak at a conference. But at the end of one class, he said this to his students: "Not every answer is written down. Some answers simply make you a better listener." No one fully understood what he meant, but no one objected either. Lucas grew up. He didn't talk about what he remembered. He talked about what he lived. That story was never truly his, and maybe that was exactly how it should be. Because some narratives don't belong to a person. They belong to a time. And when that time passes, the narrative grows silent. Silence had returned. But this time, no one tried to break it. Time really was a strange thing. It never announced its arrival, and when it left, it never looked back. But there were traces that remained, even after time had passed. They reminded you where something had once moved through. Lucas wasn't carrying those traces anymore, but he wasn't denying them either. Like a child who remembers a bad dream in the morning and forgets it by afternoon. Carter understood this best one day. Lucas was playing in the park when he fell. His knee scraped. It bled. He cried. Carter ran over, speaking with instinct. "It'll pass," he said. "It's nothing." Lucas sniffed. "I know," he said. "It's temporary." That word wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't a burden. In that moment, Elena thought of something. There are words that crush you during one part of your life. Then one day, the same word becomes ordinary. That's where healing begins. Months after leaving Cairo, a colleague asked Carter, "Whatever happened with that papyrus?" Carter paused for a brief moment. Then he said only this: "It found its place." "It wasn't published?" the colleague asked. "No." "That's a shame," the man said. "It could have been something big." Carter smiled. "It already was," he said, "just not with us." Lucas kept growing. He didn't become someone who remembered. He didn't become someone who told. He became someone who lived. And maybe that was the most honest ending. Because some stories aren't meant to be read. They're meant to be lived, and then left behind. Time takes them and leaves silence in their place. But that silence is never empty. It simply knows where it belongs. Carter thought about that sentence for a long time. I'm here now. Even coming from a child, it was a complete sentence. A sentence that had said goodbye to the past and wasn't bargaining with the future. That evening, as he left the museum, Carter didn't look back for the first time. Not at the papyrus, not at the display cases, not at the unanswered questions. Because some questions don't become incomplete when they remain unanswered. On the contrary, they find their place. Eleanor realized this when Lucas fell asleep. His face was calm. His brow wasn't tense. It was as if he had finally arrived at a place he had been waiting for a very long time. For a mother, there was no greater closure than that. Years later, very few people still knew this story. There was no article, no documentary, no heated debate. And that wasn't a failure, because the story had been left in the right place, a place where it could protect itself. The papyrus was still there, silent, unassuming, calling out to no one. But if someone stood before it, without rushing, they might feel this. Some texts are not meant to be read. Some testimonies are not meant to be explained. And some stories are only completed when they are left behind with respect. And time, in those moments, quietly takes its place without anyone noticing. When silence finally settled in, no one tried to fill it. That mattered, because some empty spaces aren't meant to be filled. They're meant to be protected. As Lucas grew older, he never asked a single question about those days. Not why, not how. It was as if he had left a room and closed the door behind him, without putting the key in his pocket, without planning to return. For Elena, this was the greatest relief of motherhood. Because when a child makes peace with their past, their future becomes lighter. Years later, Carter described it this way. Some experiences don't make you wiser. They just make you more careful. He spoke less now. He listened more. But the real difference was this. He could tell which moments were worth listening to. One day, Lucas came home from school. He put his homework on the table, took off his shoes, and started playing, as if nothing had ever happened. That was the moment the story truly ended, because great stories don't end with dramatic finales. They end with quiet normality, with a child playing, with a mother taking a deep breath, with a man no longer searching for something to write, and the space that remained was no longer empty. It was simply silent. And that silence was the most honest ending the story could give. Time moved on, quietly, without anyone noticing, without hurting anyone. Lucas grew up. His life became like other lives. He made wrong decisions. He believed some decisions were right. Sometimes he stopped. Sometimes he rushed. But he never had to walk carrying a burden that was never meant to be his. For Elena, that was enough. Because a mother doesn't wish for her child to be special. She wishes for them to be free. And Lucas was free. Years later, as Carter went through his old notebooks, he didn't return to those pages. He tore some notes out. He kept others. But most importantly, he never tried to finish any of them, because some stories are not meant to be completed. They are simply left behind, and leaving them behind is not giving up. It is respect. One day, standing in the very middle of his own life, Lucas didn't remember this story at all. And maybe that was the truest form of remembering, because real healing is not being able to tell what happened. It's no longer needing to tell it. The story didn't end here, but it chose to fall silent here. And sometimes the greatest gift a story can offer is making peace with silence. That question wasn't asking for an answer. It wasn't a challenge either. It was more like a quiet invitation. Lucas was no longer the proof of this story. He wasn't an example. He had simply shown one thing. A person can encounter a burden that doesn't belong to them. They can carry it for a while, and then they can learn to let it go. This wasn't an extraordinary ability. It wasn't a miracle. It was the most simple form of being human. For Carter, this story didn't teach him the limits of science. It taught him the limits of the human being, how far to look and where to stop. For Elena, it meant only one thing. A mother shouldn't protect her child from the world, but from the excesses of the world. And Lucas, he never claimed this story. He was never the one carrying it. Their paths had crossed for a short time, and then he had gone on his way. Maybe that was the whole point. Life leaves its deepest marks in its quietest moments. And sometimes, you know a story has truly healed when there's no longer a need to tell it. The story ended here. But this wasn't an ending. It was simply standing in the right place.